In some of my past videos, I have stated that I believe there are basically 3 different types of triggers on a handgun. Now, some people have asked me, would you clarify that? Could you explain that to us, what you mean by there's 3 different types of triggers? Well, based on my ability to get my point across in other videos I've done, I actually doubt that I will be able to explain it to you, but I'll try. When I say there's basically 3 different types of triggers, I don't mean there's only 3 different types of triggers. I mean there's 3 basic types of triggers that most triggers either fall into those categories or somewhere in between. It's kind of like a scale. And at one end of the scale, you have one of the types of triggers, which is a range or competition trigger. And at the other end of the scale, you have a type of trigger that I like to refer to as a combat trigger. And then somewhere right in between is a self-defense trigger. It's like a scale of range to combat with self-defense in the middle, and all triggers, I think, fall somewhere on this scale. Now, the triggers on the one end, the competition/range triggers, those are very light triggers. Sometimes people refer to them as a hair trigger. A good example of that would be my Sig Sauer X5. This gun is a single action only gun with a very light trigger. The trigger weight is only about 2.5 pounds. When you pull that trigger, you barely feel it. You don't really feel any extra pressure on the pad of your finger from just putting your finger on the trigger. It is very light. That's great for the range. That's great for competition. That really light, short, crisp trigger really helps you stay on target and fire as quickly as you need to fire. And you really don't worry about negligent discharges with a competition or a range gun because the gun is always pointed down range. That light trigger might be a liability under other circumstances, but when your gun is pointed at the target and you know it's only going to be pointed at the target, that trigger is perfect for hitting that target. Like I said, they're usually single action triggers for range or competition because that really works great for hitting your target. Very short, very light, very crisp. You can barely tell you pulled the trigger, and that's what I call a range or a competition trigger. Now, on the other end of the scale, you have combat triggers, which are basically the opposite of a range or a competition trigger. A combat trigger has to be very heavy, very deliberate, but it still needs to be short and crisp because you never know when you're going to need it. A perfect example of that would be a Browning high power. They are built with combat in mind. Their triggers are designed for combat use. This one here has been lightened considerably, but it's still a good 6 pounds to pull that trigger. But the trigger is short and very crisp. A standard trigger on a Browning high power is more in the 8.5 pound range to 9 pound range. Very deliberate. Now you might ask, well, why does a trigger for combat need to be so deliberate? Wouldn't it be more like a range trigger? No, it needs to be deliberate for a couple of reasons. One of which is, in the military, it's not like life with your gun everywhere else. You actually often hold people at gunpoint who haven't done anything until you can verify that they haven't done anything. You end up pointing your gun at a lot of people that you don't want to shoot. And a lot of the time, you're wearing gloves while you're doing it. So you want a trigger that isn't going to go off when you don't want it to go off, by accident, by negligence. You want a trigger that's very deliberate. But if you do have to start using it, you want it to be deliberate, but you still want it to be a short, crisp trigger, preferably with some good feedback on it. And remember, under a high stress situation, a combat situation, there's a saying that says 10 pounds feels like 2 pounds. And that's very much true when it comes to a combat situation and a handgun trigger. Often combat triggers are single action only guns, but they have a more deliberate pull. Now, sometimes they'll be double action, single action, and that is also very well suited for combat use, but a good single action heavy pull is my preference. And now we have in the middle the self-defense trigger. Now, self-defense trigger is kind of like the best of both worlds and the worst of both worlds. It's a little heavier than a range trigger, so it's not quite as accurate, but it's lighter than a combat trigger, so it's a little easier to use if you're not an expert marksman. In self-defense situations, you're not really holding people at gunpoint, so you don't got to worry that it's so light that you're accidentally going to shoot someone innocent while you're holding them at gunpoint, because if we draw our guns, there's usually reason to shoot within a moment or two. It's not something we do routinely just pointing our guns at people like you do in the military. A good example of a self-defense trigger would be my Arsenal Strike 1, and many other guns I own, but this one is a good example. It has a trigger that's about 4.5 pounds. It's light, it's crisp, and it doesn't have a lot of travel, but it's still quite deliberate. You actually have to put some pressure on the trigger to make it fire. Now, another good example of a self-defense trigger would be my Sig Sauer P239. Now, unlike the Arsenal Strike 1, which is a double action only striker fired gun, this is a double action single action gun. That double action trigger is like 9 pounds. It's very deliberate. You're not going to fire that unintentionally. But if shit hits the fan and you have to keep firing, every subsequent shot is going to be a light single action pull in the 4.5 to 5 pound range. Both of those guns are really good self-defense trigger. A self-defense trigger, like I said, has to be heavy enough that you're not going to fire it unintentionally, that you're going to fire off a round you didn't mean to fire. People have been convicted for murder because of that. Even though they were justified in feeling threatened, the fact that they fired too soon because of a light trigger meant they spent time in jail. But if you do need to start firing, that Arsenal Strike 1 trigger, that light double action trigger at 4.5 pounds, it's going to be easy to control and easy to hit your target with, but not so light that you do so accidentally or prematurely. And on the Sig Sauer, you're definitely not going to fire off that first shot prematurely because of that long double action pull on that first shot. And then you'll have good single action shots afterwards. In fact, the single action shots on the Sig will be lighter than the Arsenal Strike 1, but it kind of evens out. And plus, in a high stress situation, you're probably not going to notice those trigger weight differences anyway. You're probably not going to notice the difference between a 3 pound pull and a 4.5 or a 5 pound pull. So on those two guns, it would just be preference. You just have to think about what you need for self-defense. It basically comes down to the fact that range/competition triggers are very light, crisp, featherweight triggers, usually single action only, and combat triggers are often single action only, but much more deliberate, a lot heavier, and sometimes they're double action, single action, depending on the gun. And self-defense guns, self-defense triggers, they fall somewhere right in the middle. Like I said, they have the best and the worst of both worlds. And which one is best for you comes down to what type of gun that you prefer.